Welcome to my YouTube channel, Tune of Revenge. The walls have ears, my grandfather used to say. I never understood what he meant until the day I learned that we would build them ourselves and make them listen. My name is Kyle, and this is the story of how we turned our master's greatest pride into his ultimate prison, how we transformed wood and stone and mortar into weapons more powerful than any gun, and how we became ghosts haunting a house we built with our own bleeding hands. It began in the spring of 1851, when Master Richard Harrington announced his grand vision to the assembled slaves of his South Carolina plantation. We stood in the yard behind the overseer's quarters, 43 souls ranging from children to elders, all of us property in the eyes of the law, all of us tools to be used for whatever purpose our master desired. Harrington was a tall man with a face like carved granite and eyes that held no warmth. He had inherited the plantation from his father 10 years earlier and had spent that decade expanding his holdings, purchasing more land and more slaves, building his wealth on our backs. But wealth alone was not enough for Richard Harrington. He wanted legacy. He wanted to be remembered as the man who built the finest mansion in all of South Carolina, a monument to his success that would stand for generations. "I am going to build a house," he announced, his voice carrying across the yard. "Not just any house, but a masterpiece. 3 stories, 20 rooms, with columns like a Greek temple and gardens that will be the envy of Charleston society. It will take years to complete, and every one of you will contribute to its construction. This will be my legacy, and you should be honored to be part of it." Honored. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. We would build his monument with our hands, our sweat, our blood, and when it was finished, we would still be slaves, still property, still less than human in his eyes. But standing next to me was a man who saw something different in Harrington's announcement. His name was Yerboa, and he was the oldest slave on the plantation, somewhere past 70 years, though no one knew his exact age. He had been born in West Africa in the Ashanti Kingdom, and had been captured and brought to America as a young man. Unlike most of us who had been born into slavery and knew nothing else, Yerboa remembered freedom. He remembered his life before the chains, and he remembered his profession. In his homeland, Yerboa had been an architect, a builder of great structures, a man who understood how spaces could be shaped to serve human needs. That knowledge had made him valuable to Harrington's father, who had used Yerboa's skills to construct barns and outbuildings and the modest house that the family currently occupied. But it had also made Yerboa dangerous, because a man who knows how to build also knows how to destroy, how to hide, how to create secrets within walls. As Harrington continued his speech about marble floors and crystal chandeliers, I felt Yerboa's hand on my shoulder. He leaned close and whispered in my ear, his voice barely audible, "This house he wants to build. It will be his undoing. I will show you how." I was 16 years old, strong and quick, apprenticed to Yerboa to learn carpentry. I had been working with him for 3 years, learning to shape wood, to join beams, to create structures that would stand against time and weather. But I had never heard him speak like this, with such quiet intensity, such hidden purpose. That night, after the day's work was done, and we had returned to our cabin, Yerboa drew me aside. The cabin we shared with 8 other men was cramped and poorly lit, but Yerboa found a corner where we could speak without being overheard. "In my homeland," he said, speaking in the mixture of English and Twi that he used when he wanted to ensure only I could understand, "we built palaces for kings, great structures with many rooms, many purposes. But we also built secrets into those palaces, hidden passages, concealed chambers, places where the king could move unseen, where he could listen to his advisers and know if they were loyal or treacherous." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because Harrington wants us to build him a palace, and we will build it exactly as he desires, beautiful, grand, impressive. But we will also build something else, something he will never know about. We will build secrets into every wall, passages behind every room, chambers where we can hide, where we can listen, where we can move like spirits through his house. We will build him a prison disguised as a palace, and he will never know until it is too late." I stared at him, my heart beginning to race with a mixture of fear and excitement. "That's impossible. The overseers will watch us. The white carpenters Harrington hires will see what we're doing. They will see what they expect to see," Yeboah said with a slight smile. "White men do not truly look at the work of slaves. They assume we are too stupid to do anything beyond what we are told. We will use their contempt as a shield. We will build their house, and we will build our weapon, and they will never know the difference." "And if we're caught, then we die," Yeboah said simply. "But we are dying already, Kyle. Slowly, day by day, our spirits crushed under the weight of bondage. At least this way we die fighting. At least this way we leave something behind. A weapon that others can use long after we are gone." I thought about his words through the long night, lying on my pallet while the other men snored around me. What Yeboah was proposing was madness, treason, a crime that would get us both killed if discovered. But it was also brilliant, a form of resistance that required not violence, but intelligence, not strength, but cunning. By morning I had made my decision. "Teach me," I told Yeboah as we walked to the construction site. "Teach me everything," and so he did. The construction of Harrington's mansion began in earnest that summer. Harrington had hired a white architect from Charleston, a pompous man named Whitmore, who arrived with elaborate drawings and an even more elaborate sense of his own importance. He treated us slaves as if we were draft animals, pointing and shouting instructions, never bothering to learn our names or acknowledge our humanity. But Whitmore made a crucial mistake. He assumed that because we were slaves, we were ignorant. He would leave his drawings unattended, discuss structural details within our hearing, explain his plans to Harrington without considering that we might be listening and understanding. Yea, studied those drawings with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He would examine them when Whitmore was distracted, memorizing every detail, every measurement, every structural element. And then, in the privacy of our cabin at night, he would sketch his own drawings in the dirt floor, showing me how Whitmore's design could be modified, how spaces could be created within spaces, how walls could be built with hollow cores that would serve as passages. "Architecture is about controlling space," he explained. "Whitmore understands this, but only in the obvious ways. This room for dining, this room for sleeping, this room for business. But there are other ways to control space. Hidden ways. A wall that appears solid can conceal a passage. A floor that seems complete can hide a chamber below. A ceiling can contain acoustic channels that carry sound from one room to another. We will build all of these things, and Whitmore will never notice because he is looking at the surface while we are building the depths." The foundation was laid in late summer, a massive undertaking that required us to dig deep into the South Carolina clay and lay stones that would support the weight of 3 stories. It was brutal work under the August sun, with overseers watching our every move and punishing any perceived laziness with the whip. But even here in the foundation, Yeboah began to implement his plan. He designed the cellar with unusual dimensions, creating spaces that appeared to be structural supports, but were actually hollow chambers. He built drainage channels that were wider than necessary, creating passages that a man could crawl through. He positioned support pillars in ways that created blind spots, areas that could not be seen from the cellar stairs. "The foundation is everything," he told me as we worked. "If we build the secrets correctly here, everything above will follow naturally. The white men see only what they expect. A cellar for storage, pillars for support, drains for water. They do not see the network we are creating beneath their feet." I watched and learned. my respect for ye's genius growing with each passing day. He was not just a carpenter or even an architect. He was an artist, a strategist, a man who understood that the most powerful weapons are often invisible. As autumn arrived and the walls began to rise, Yeboah's health began to fail. He had always been strong despite his age, but the brutal pace of construction was taking its toll. He developed a cough that would not go away, and I could see him growing thinner, more frail, his movements slower and more painful. But he refused to stop working. He drove himself relentlessly, knowing that time was running out, that he needed to teach me everything before he was gone. We worked side by side building the first floor walls with their hidden passages, creating acoustic channels that would carry sound from the main rooms down to the cellar, installing panels that appeared to be solid, but could be opened from the inside. Remember, he would say again and again, the house must function perfectly as a house. Harrington must never suspect that it is anything more. Every secret must be invisible. Every passage must be silent. Every chamber must be sealed so perfectly that no one will ever find it unless they know exactly where to look. The trigger, the moment when I truly understood the power of what we were building, came in December of that first year. Harrington held a gathering at the construction site, inviting neighboring plantation owners to see the progress on his grand mansion. They walked through the partially completed structure, admiring the high ceilings and large windows, the quality of the woodwork, and the elegance of the design. Yeboah and I were working on the second floor, installing wall panels, when we heard Harrington and his guests directly below us, in what would become his study. They were discussing business, the price of cotton, the cost of slaves, the political situation in Washington, and then the conversation turned darker. I'm planning to sell off some of my stock next spring, Harrington said, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustic channel Yeboah had built into the wall. The older ones, the ones who are no longer productive, and some of the children. I can get good prices for children in the New Orleans market. My hands froze on the wood. I was holding stock. He was talking about us as if we were cattle and children. He was planning to sell children away from their parents to break apart families for profit. I looked at Yeboah and saw tears streaming down his weathered face. Now you understand, he whispered. Now you see why we must do this. This house will be his pride, but it will also be his downfall. We are building a weapon, Kyle, and someday someone will use it to destroy him. That night Yeboah's cough worsened. By morning he was burning with fever. The plantation's overseer, a brutal man named Crenshaw, took one look at him and declared him too sick to work. Put him in the sick house, Crenshaw ordered. If he recovers, he can return to work. If not, he shrugged, the gesture making clear that Yeboah's life meant nothing to him. I visited Yeboah in the sick house every evening after work. It was a small, drafty building where slaves who were too ill to work were left to recover or die with minimal care. Yeboah lay on a thin pallet, his breathing labored, his body wasting away, but his mind remained sharp. Each evening he would pull me close and whisper instructions describing the secrets he had planned for the upper floors, the passages that still needed to be built, the acoustic channels that would need to be installed. He drew diagrams in the air with his trembling fingers, making me repeat back every detail until he was satisfied that I understood. You must finish what we started, he said on what would be our last conversation. You must build the secrets into every wall, every floor, every ceiling, and when the house is complete, you must use it. Use it to protect our people. Use it to strike back at Harrington. Use it to prove that we are not powerless, that we can fight even from within our chains. I will, I promised, I swear it. Yeboah died 3 days later on a cold January morning. They buried him in the slave cemetery at the edge of the plantation, a plot of rough ground marked by wooden crosses that would rot and disappear within a few years. There was no ceremony, no recognition of the man he had been, the knowledge he had possessed, the legacy he was leaving behind. But I knew I carried his knowledge, his plans, his vision, and I would complete what he had started. I was 17 years old, and I had just inherited a weapon that would take years to build, but would last for generations. The walls of Harrington's mansion would have ears and eyes and secret passages where ghosts could walk, and I would be one of those ghosts, haunting the house I built, using its secrets to protect my people and destroy the man who thought he owned us. The construction continued through the winter and into the spring. Without Yeboah, I became the lead carpenter, working under the supervision of a white master carpenter named Douglas, who had been hired to ensure the quality of the work. Douglas was less contemptuous than Whitmore, actually bothering to learn my name and occasionally acknowledging when I did good work. But he still saw me as property, as a tool to be used, and he never suspected that I was building something far more complex than the house he thought he was supervising. I implemented Yeboah's plans with meticulous care, building the hidden passages into the second floor walls, creating the acoustic channels that would carry sound from the bedrooms down to the cellar, installing the concealed panels that would allow access to the secret spaces. I worked slowly and carefully, making sure that every secret was invisible, that nothing would give away what I was doing, and I began to recruit others. Carefully, cautiously, I brought a few trusted slaves into the conspiracy, men and women who could be relied upon to keep the secret, who understood what we were building and why it mattered. They helped me in small ways, creating distractions when I needed to work on a secret passage unobserved, passing messages, keeping watch. The mansion rose slowly month by month, year by year. 3 stories of brick and wood and marble with tall columns across the front and a grand staircase in the entrance hall. It was beautiful, exactly as Harrington had envisioned, a monument to his wealth and power. But it was also something else, a labyrinth of secrets, a weapon disguised as a palace, a trap waiting to be sprung. And I was the keeper of its secrets, the ghost in its walls, the instrument of a vengeance that Yeboah had conceived and that I would execute. The walls had ears, and soon they would speak. The mansion was completed in the autumn of 1856, 5 years after construction began. It stood like a white temple on a hill overlooking the plantation, its columns gleaming in the afternoon sun, its windows reflecting the sky like mirrors. Harrington hosted a grand celebration, inviting the wealthiest families from Charleston and the surrounding counties to admire his achievement. I stood with the other slaves in the yard, watching the carriages arrive, watching the white guests in their fine clothes ascend the steps and enter the house we had built. They exclaimed over the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the elaborate woodwork. They praised Harrington's taste and vision. Not one of them acknowledged the slaves who had actually created this monument, who had spent 5 years of our lives building someone else's dream, but I knew something they did not. I knew that beneath the beauty, woven into the very structure of the house, was a network of secrets that would give me power over the man who thought he owned me. The breaking point, the moment when I truly understood what I had to do, came 3 weeks after the mansion's completion. Harrington had moved his family into the house, and life on the plantation had settled into a new routine. I had been assigned to work as a house carpenter, responsible for maintaining the structure and making any necessary repairs. This position gave me legitimate reasons to be inside the mansion, to move through its rooms, to access areas that other slaves could not enter. It also gave me access to the secret passages. The main passage ran from the cellar to the attic, hidden within the walls, accessible through concealed panels that appeared to be nothing more than decorative woodwork. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but it connected to every floor of the house. Branch passages led to observation points behind walls, to acoustic channels that carried sound from the main rooms, to small chambers where someone could hide for hours or even days. I had tested the passages during construction, but now, with the house occupied, I began to explore their true potential. The first time I used the acoustic channels, I was in the cellar, ostensibly checking for water damage after a heavy rain, but I was actually positioned beneath Harrington's study at a point where Yeboah had designed the floor to act as a sound conductor. I could hear every word spoken in the room above as clearly as if I were standing next to the speakers. Harrington was meeting with his overseer, Crenshaw, discussing plantation business. Most of it was routine crop yields, equipment repairs, discipline issues among the slaves. But then the conversation turned to something that made my blood run cold. "I've been reviewing the accounts," Harrington said, "and I've decided we need to reduce costs. We're carrying too many unproductive slaves, the elderly, the very young, those with chronic health issues. I want you to prepare a list of 20 individuals who can be sold off. I've already contacted a trader in Charleston who specializes in the New Orleans market. 20, Crenshaw said. That's a significant number, sir." "It's necessary," Harrington replied coldly. "This house cost more than I anticipated. I need to recoup some of that expense, and the quickest way is to liquidate assets that aren't generating sufficient return." Assets. He was talking about people, about families, about children, about elders who had spent their entire lives working for his family, and he was planning to sell them away to break apart families, to send them to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where most slaves died within a few years. I listened as they discussed which slaves would be sold, hearing names I knew, people I had grown up with, old Martha, who had been like a grandmother to me, young Samuel and his sister Rebecca, children who would be sold separately and never see each other again. Thomas, whose wife had just given birth to their first child, 20 people, 20 lives destroyed to pay for the mansion I had helped build. I left the cellar in a daze, my mind reeling with rage and grief. I had known that Harrington was cruel. All slaveholders were cruel by the very nature of what they did. But hearing him discuss human beings as if they were nothing more than livestock to be sold for profit, brought home the full horror of our situation in a way I had never quite grasped before. That night I lay awake in my cabin thinking about Yeboah's words. "We are building a weapon," he had said, "and someday someone will use it to destroy him. That someone would be me, and the time was now." Over the next weeks I began to truly understand the power of what Yeboah and I had built. The mansion was not just a house. It was an intelligence network, a surveillance system, a means of gathering information that could be used against our oppressor. I spent every spare moment in the secret passages, listening to conversations, learning Harrington's business dealings, discovering his secrets. I learned that he was deeply in debt, that the mansion had cost far more than he could afford, that he was desperate to maintain the appearance of wealth while his actual finances were crumbling. I learned that he was involved in illegal schemes, smuggling, fraud, bribery of local officials. I learned about his personal life, his affairs with slave women, his wife's growing suspicion and resentment, his children's fear of their father's temper. Knowledge, I realized, was power, and I was accumulating knowledge that could destroy him. But knowledge alone was not enough. I needed to act, to use what I had learned to protect my people and strike back at Harrington. The question was, how? The answer came from an unexpected source, Harrington's own paranoia. He had always been a suspicious man, quick to see betrayal and conspiracy in the actions of others. As his financial situation worsened, his paranoia intensified. He began to suspect that his business associates were cheating him, that his overseers were stealing from him, that even his own family was plotting against him. I decided to feed that paranoia, to use the mansion itself as a weapon of psychological warfare. It started small. I would use the secret passages to move objects. A document that Harrington had left on his desk would appear in a different room. A valuable item would vanish and then reappear days later in an unexpected location. I would create sounds, footsteps in empty hallways, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, doors that would open and close on their own. Harrington began to notice. At first he blamed the slaves, accusing us of theft and mischief. But the incidents continued even when he locked rooms and posted guards. He began to talk about the house being haunted, about spirits that walked its halls. His wife, a nervous woman named Catherine, became convinced that the house was cursed. She heard the whispers, saw the moving shadows, felt the presence of something unseen. She begged Harrington to leave, to sell the house, and move back to their old residence. But Harrington refused, his pride preventing him from admitting that his grand mansion might be anything less than perfect. I escalated my campaign using the acoustic channels. I would whisper messages that only Harrington could hear, accusations, threats, reminders of his crimes. I would leave notes in his study, written in a hand he didn't recognize, revealing details about his illegal activities that only someone with intimate knowledge of his business could know. Harrington began to unravel. He drank more, slept less, became increasingly erratic and violent. He fired Crenshaw, suspecting him of being the source of the mysterious messages. He hired private investigators to find the person who was tormenting him. He even brought in a minister to perform an exorcism. Nothing worked because the source of his torment was not a person he could fire or a spirit he could exorcise. It was the house itself, the very walls he had commissioned, turned against him by the slaves he had forced to build it. But I knew that psychological warfare alone would not save the 20 people Harrington planned to sell. I needed to do something more direct, more dramatic, something that would not just torment Harrington, but actively prevent him from carrying out his plan. The idea came to me one night as I sat in the hidden chamber beneath Harrington's study, listening to him discuss the upcoming sale with a slave trader from Charleston. The trader would arrive in 2 weeks to inspect the slaves and complete the transaction. The 20 individuals had already been selected and informed that they would be sold. The grief in the quarters was overwhelming. Families were being torn apart. Old Martha wept constantly, knowing she would die alone in some distant place. Young Samuel and Rebecca clung to each other, terrified of being separated. Thomas's wife begged Harrington to let her family stay together, and was whipped for her insolence. I could not let this happen. I would not let this happen, and then I realized the mansion had not just ears and eyes. It had hiding places, chambers within walls, spaces beneath floors, rooms that officially did not exist, places where people could hide, perhaps for days or even weeks, without being discovered. What if the slaves Harrington planned to sell simply disappeared? What if when the trader arrived they were nowhere to be found? Harrington would be humiliated, would lose the sale, would be forced to explain how 20 slaves had vanished from a locked plantation. It was audacious, dangerous, and possibly insane, but it was also the only way to save them. I began to plan in earnest, mapping out which hidden chambers could accommodate people, calculating how much food and water would be needed, determining how we could manage waste and maintain absolute silence. The largest hidden chamber was in the attic, a space about 12 ft x 20 ft, that existed between the true attic and a false ceiling below. It could hold all 20 people if they were willing to endure cramped conditions, but getting them into the house and into the hidden chamber without being seen would be nearly impossible. The mansion was constantly occupied with Harrington's family and various servants moving through its rooms at all hours, and once they were hidden, they would need to remain absolutely silent because any sound would give away their location. I spent sleepless nights refining the plan, considering every possible problem, every way it could go wrong, and then I began to recruit the people who would help me execute it. I started with Marcus, a man about my age who worked in the stables and who I had known since childhood. I trusted him completely, and I knew he was smart and brave enough to help with something this dangerous. "I need your help," I told him one night, speaking quietly in the darkness behind the stables. "I'm going to hide the 20 people Harrington plans to sell. I'm going to hide them inside the mansion in secret chambers that were built into the walls during construction, and I need people I can trust to help me get them there and keep them supplied." Marcus stared at me for a long moment. "You're serious, completely serious. If we're caught, we'll be killed," I said bluntly, slowly and publicly. "But if we do nothing, those 20 people will be sold away, and most of them will die on the sugar plantations within a few years. At least this way, we're fighting back." Marcus nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next week, I recruited 5 more people into the conspiracy. Individuals who had family members among the 20 to be sold, who had the most to lose and therefore the strongest motivation to help. I explained the plan to each of them separately, swearing them to secrecy, making sure they understood the risks, and then I approached the 20 people who were to be sold, gathering them in small groups in the dead of night, telling them about the hidden chambers and offering them a choice. "I can hide you," I said, "inside the mansion in secret rooms that Harrington doesn't know exist. You'll have to stay hidden for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer, until the trader gives up and leaves. It will be uncomfortable, frightening, and dangerous. If you're discovered, we'll all be killed. But if you succeed, you won't be sold. You'll still be slaves, but you'll be here with your families, not sent away to die in Louisiana." Every one of them agreed. They were willing to risk death to stay with their families to avoid being sold into the hell of the sugar plantations. The plan was set. In 3 days, when the trader was scheduled to arrive, the 20 people would vanish into the walls of Harrington's mansion, and I would prove that the slaves he thought he owned were not powerless, that we could fight back in ways he had never imagined, that the house he had built as a monument to his greatness would become his greatest humiliation. The breaking point had come and passed. Now it was time to act. The 3 days before the trader's arrival passed with agonizing slowness. Every moment felt like a held breath, every sound like a potential disaster. I moved through my duties in a fog of anxiety and determination, constantly reviewing the plan, looking for flaws, preparing for every possible contingency. The logistics were staggering. 20 people needed to be moved into the mansion without being seen, hidden in the attic chamber and supplied with enough food, water, and other necessities to survive for at least 2 weeks in cramped, dark conditions. And all of this had to be accomplished while maintaining the appearance of normal plantation life, while giving Harrington and his overseers no indication that anything unusual was happening. I had mapped out every step with obsessive detail. But I knew that even the best plan could fall apart when confronted with reality. One mistake, one unexpected observer, one moment of bad luck, and we would all die. The hidden attic chamber was accessed through a panel in the 3rd floor hallway, disguised as part of the decorative wainscoting. The panel could only be opened from the outside using a specific sequence of pressure points, a security measure Yaboa had designed to prevent accidental discovery. Once inside, a narrow passage led up through the wall to the chamber itself. which existed in the space between the true attic and the false ceiling of the third floor. I had prepared the chamber as best I could, bringing in blankets, chamber pots, water jugs, and dried food over the course of several weeks, always working at night, always moving in absolute silence through the secret passages. The chamber had ventilation, small gaps in the exterior wall, hidden behind decorative trim, but it would still be hot, airless, and uncomfortable. The 20 people would have to endure those conditions for as long as it took for the trader to give up and leave 2 weeks minimum, possibly longer. They would have to remain absolutely silent during the day when the household was active. They would have to manage their waste, their fear, their desperation to move and speak and breathe fresh air. It would be a test of endurance unlike anything they had experienced before. But they were willing to try because the alternative, being sold away from their families, was worse than any temporary suffering. The plan called for moving them into the mansion in small groups over the course of a single night. The night before the trader was scheduled to arrive, we would use the hours between midnight and dawn, when the household was asleep and the overseers were less vigilant. Marcus and the others I had recruited would help guide people from the quarters to the mansion, using paths that avoided the main yard and the overseer's house. I would be inside the mansion, waiting at a side entrance that I could unlock from within, ready to guide each group through the halls and up to the third floor. The greatest danger would be on the third floor itself, where Harrington's children had their bedrooms. We would have to move past those rooms in absolute silence, open the hidden panel, and get everyone into the passage and up to the chamber without waking anyone. One sound, one creaking floorboard, one sleepless child emerging from a bedroom, and it would all be over. I spent the day before the operation in a state of controlled terror, going through my normal duties while my mind raced through every possible disaster scenario. I checked and rechecked the hidden panel, making sure it would open smoothly and silently. I verified that the passage to the attic chamber was clear. I positioned supplies at strategic points along the route. And I prayed not to the Christian God that the white preachers told us about, the God who supposedly wanted us to be obedient slaves, but to the spirits of my ancestors, to Yaboa's memory, to whatever forces in the universe might care about justice and freedom. As night fell, I made my way to the mansion, using my position as house carpenter to justify my presence. I told the house slaves that I needed to check for roof leaks after the recent rains, and no one questioned me. Why would they? I was just a slave doing his assigned work. I positioned myself in a third-floor storage room, waiting for midnight, listening to the sounds of the household settling into sleep. Harrington and his wife retired to their bedroom on the second floor. The children went to their rooms on the third floor. The house slaves finished their evening duties and retreated to their quarters in a separate building behind the mansion. By 11:00, the house was silent. At midnight, I made my way down to the side entrance, a small door used by servants, located in a part of the house that was not visible from the overseer's quarters or the main yard. I unlocked it from the inside and waited in the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard throughout the house. The first group arrived 10 minutes later, 5 people moving like shadows through the night, led by Marcus. I recognized old Martha, her face set with determination despite her age and fear. With her were 2 others from the 20, a middle-aged couple named James and Ruth, and 2 teenage boys, brothers named David and Isaac. I put my finger to my lips, signaling silence, and gestured for them to follow me. We moved through the dark hallways like ghosts, our bare feet silent on the wooden floors. Every creak, every settling sound of the house made my heart skip a beat. But we reached the third floor without incident. The hidden panel was located in a section of hallway between 2 of the children's bedrooms. I could hear soft breathing from behind one of the doors. Someone sleeping, but sleeping lightly. We would have to be absolutely silent. I pressed the sequence of points on the wainscoting, and the panel swung open with a whisper of sound. The passage beyond was pitch black, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I had brought a small candle shielded, so its light would not be visible from the hallway, and I used it to guide the first group into the passage. Old Martha hesitated at the entrance, her eyes wide with fear. The passage was narrow and dark, leading up at a steep angle into unknown darkness. For someone her age it must have seemed like a tomb. I took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Trust me," I whispered, barely audible. "I will keep you safe." She nodded and stepped into the passage. The others followed, and I guided them up the steep incline to the attic chamber. It took nearly 10 minutes to get all 5 of them settled, to show them where the supplies were stored, to explain in whispers that they must remain absolutely silent during the day. "I will come back tomorrow night," I told them. "I will bring more food and water, but during the day you must not make any sound, no talking, no moving around. Harrington's children are directly below you. If they hear anything, if they become suspicious, we are all dead." They nodded, their faces pale in the candle light, and I left them there in the darkness, closing the panel behind me and returning to the side entrance to wait for the next group. The night passed in a blur of tension and fear. 4 more groups arrived at intervals, each one guided through the dark house and up to the hidden chamber. By the time the last group was safely hidden, it was nearly 5:00 in the morning, and the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. All 20 people were now hidden in the attic chamber, crammed into a space that was barely large enough to hold them all. They would have to endure heat, darkness, cramped conditions, and absolute silence for at least 2 weeks. But they were together. They were not being sold, and they were proving that slaves were not powerless, that we could resist in ways our masters never imagined. I locked the side entrance and made my way back to the quarters, arriving just as the wake-up bell rang. I had been awake all night, but I could not show any sign of exhaustion. I had to go through the day as if nothing unusual had happened, as if 20 people had not just vanished into the walls of Harrington's mansion. The discovery came at the morning roll call. Krenor's replacement, an overseer named Barrett, went through the list of slaves, calling out names and checking them off. When he reached the names of the 20 who were to be sold, there was no response. "Martha," he called. "Martha, step forward. Silence. James, Ruth, Samuel, Rebecca." No one answered. Barrett's face grew red with anger and confusion. He called out all 20 names, and not one of them appeared. "Where are they?" he demanded, turning to the assembled slaves. "Where did they go?" We stared back at him in silence, our faces carefully blank. We knew nothing. We had seen nothing. 20 people had simply vanished in the night. Barrett ran to the mansion to inform Harrington. Within minutes the plantation was in chaos. Overseers searched every building, every field, every possible hiding place. Dogs were brought in to track scents. The quarters were torn apart with personal belongings scattered and trampled as the searchers looked for any clue to where the missing slaves might have gone. But they found nothing. 20 people had disappeared without a trace, as if they had been spirited away by invisible hands. Harrington was beside himself with rage and panic. The trader was arriving that afternoon, expecting to inspect and purchase 20 slaves. How could Harrington explain that they had simply vanished? It made him look incompetent, careless, possibly complicit in their escape. I watched the chaos from a distance, maintaining my expression of confused innocence, while inside I was exulting. The first phase of the plan had succeeded. The 20 were hidden, and no one had any idea where they were. But the hardest part was still ahead, keeping them hidden, keeping them supplied, keeping them silent, all while Harrington and his overseers tore the plantation apart, looking for them. The trader arrived in the afternoon, a thin man with cold eyes named Jessup, who specialized in buying slaves for the Louisiana market. Harrington met with him in his study, and I positioned myself in the cellar below, listening through the acoustic channel. "I don't understand how this could have happened," Harrington said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "They were here yesterday, all accounted for, and then this morning they're simply gone." "Have you checked the roads north?" Jessup asked. "They might have run. We've had patrols out all day. No sign of them, no tracks, no sightings, nothing. It's as if they vanished into thin air. Then they're hiding somewhere on the plantation," Jessup said. "They have to be. 20 people can't just disappear. You need to search more thoroughly." "We've searched everywhere," Harrington insisted. "Every building, every field, every possible hiding place." "Then search again," Jessup said coldly. "I came here expecting to conduct business, and I don't intend to leave empty-handed. Find them, Harrington, or your reputation will suffer. People will say you can't control your own slaves, that you're incompetent. Is that what you want?" The threat was clear. Harrington's standing in the community depended on his ability to manage his plantation efficiently. If word spread that 20 of his slaves had escaped under his nose, he would become a laughingstock. His business relationships would suffer. His credit would dry up. "I'll find them," Harrington said, his voice hard. "Whatever it takes, I'll find them." The search intensified over the next days. Harrington brought in professional slave catchers with their dogs. He offered rewards for information. He had the overseers interrogate every slave on the plantation using threats and violence to try to extract information. But no one talked because no one except my small group of conspirators knew where the 20 were hidden. And we maintained perfect silence, perfect innocence, perfect ignorance. At night, when the household was asleep, I would slip into the mansion and make my way to the hidden chamber, bringing fresh water and food, removing waste, checking on the 20 people hidden in the darkness. They were suffering, the heat was oppressive, the cramped conditions were taking a physical and psychological toll, and the constant need for silence was maddening, but they endured. Old Martha, who I had feared would not survive the ordeal, proved to be one of the strongest, keeping the others' spirits up with whispered encouragement. Young Samuel and Rebecca clung to each other, finding comfort in their sibling bond. James and Ruth held hands in the darkness, grateful to still be together. And every day that passed without discovery was a small victory, a proof that we could resist, that we could fight back, that the house Harrington had built as a monument to his power had become a weapon against him. The tension on the plantation was unbearable. Harrington was unraveling, his paranoia reaching new heights. He was convinced that someone on the plantation knew where the missing slaves were hidden, that there was a conspiracy against him. He had slaves whipped randomly, hoping that pain would loosen tongues. He fired 2 overseers, suspecting them of complicity. He barely slept, spending his nights pacing through the mansion, searching for clues. And all the while 20 people lived in his walls, hidden in plain sight, breathing the same air, existing in a space he walked past multiple times a day without ever suspecting. It was the ultimate irony, the perfect revenge. Harrington had forced us to build his mansion, and we had built it with secrets he would never discover. We had turned his pride into our weapon, his monument into our fortress. But I knew we could not sustain this indefinitely. Eventually, someone would make a mistake, or Harrington would get lucky, or the 20 people in the attic would reach the breaking point and make a sound that would give them away. We needed an end game, a way to resolve the situation that would save the 20 people without exposing the secret of the hidden chambers. Because those chambers were too valuable to lose, they represented a form of power that could be used again and again for years to come, as long as their existence remained unknown. I spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to end this, how to make the 20 people reappear in a way that would not reveal where they had been hidden. And slowly an idea began to form, audacious, risky, but possibly brilliant. I would give Harrington what he wanted, the missing slaves, but I would do it in a way that would make him look foolish, that would undermine his authority, that would prove to everyone on the plantation that he was not the all-powerful master he pretended to be. I would make the 20 people appear in the last place. Anyone would think to look inside the mansion itself in rooms that had supposedly been searched multiple times. It would require perfect timing, perfect execution, and a bit of theatrical flair. But if it worked, it would be the ultimate humiliation for Harrington and the ultimate triumph for us. The hunt was about to reach its climax, and the hunter was about to become the hunted. 2 weeks after the 20 slaves vanished, Harrington was a broken man. The trader Jessup had left in disgust, spreading word throughout the region that Harrington couldn't control his own plantation. Neighboring slaveholders whispered about the incident, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed schadenfreude. Harrington's reputation was in tatters, and his financial situation was growing more desperate by the day. The plantation had become a place of fear and suspicion. Harrington trusted no one, suspected everyone, and lashed out randomly at slaves and overseers alike. His wife, Catherine, had retreated to her bedroom, claiming illness, but really just trying to escape her husband's increasingly erratic behavior. The children walked on eggshells, terrified of their father's unpredictable rages. And through it all, 20 people lived in the walls, silent and suffering, waiting for the moment when they could emerge from their tomb. That moment came on Christmas Eve 1856. I had chosen the date carefully. Christmas was traditionally a time when slaves were given a brief respite from labor, a few days of relative freedom to celebrate and spend time with family. Harrington, despite his current state of mind, would be expected to maintain that tradition, if only to avoid further damage to his reputation. The household would be focused on holiday preparations, the overseers would be less vigilant, and the general atmosphere of celebration would provide cover for what I was planning. My plan was audacious. I would make the 20 slaves reappear inside the mansion itself, in locations where they could not possibly have been hiding for 2 weeks. I would stage it to look like they had somehow infiltrated the house on Christmas Eve, perhaps planning to steal food or supplies. Harrington would discover them, would recapture them, and would be able to claim that he had foiled an attempted break-in. It would restore some of his damaged reputation, would explain where the slaves had been, hiding in the woods, planning this infiltration, and would allow the 20 to return to their families without being sold. Most importantly, it would preserve the secret of the hidden chambers, allowing them to be used again in the future. But the execution would require split, second timing, and perfect coordination. I would need to move 20 people out of the attic chamber, through the secret passages, and into various rooms throughout the mansion, all while the household was occupied with Christmas Eve dinner. I spent Christmas Eve day in a state of barely controlled anxiety, going through my duties while mentally rehearsing every step of the plan. As evening approached and the household began preparing for their holiday meal, I made my way to the mansion, ostensibly to check on some minor repair work. The Christmas Eve dinner was held in the grand dining room on the first floor with Harrington, his wife, their 3 children, and several guests from neighboring plantations. The house slaves were busy serving the meal, moving between the kitchen and the dining room, too occupied to notice one more slave moving through the hallways. I made my way to the 3rd floor and opened the hidden panel. The 20 people inside the chamber looked like ghosts, pale, thin, their eyes hollow from 2 weeks of darkness and confinement. But they were alive and they were ready. It's time, I whispered. Follow me exactly. Stay silent, move quickly, do exactly as I say. I had prepared specific locations for each person. Empty bedrooms, storage rooms, even the library on the 2nd floor. Places where they could be discovered without it seeming impossible that they had been hiding there. I guided them out of the chamber in small groups, moving them through the secret passages and positioning them in their assigned locations. Old Martha I placed in a guest bedroom on the second floor, with instructions to hide under the bed until she heard my signal. James and Ruth went into a storage room on the first floor. Young Samuel and Rebecca were positioned in the library behind a large bookshelf. Each person was placed carefully, strategically in locations that would make sense for someone who had infiltrated the house. The process took nearly an hour, and every second felt like an eternity. At any moment someone could have come upstairs, could have heard a sound, could have discovered what we were doing. But luck was with us. The household remained focused on their dinner, and we completed the positioning without incident. When everyone was in place, I made my way to the kitchen, where the house slaves were preparing dessert to be served to the dinner guests. "There's something wrong in the library," I said to one of the house slaves, a woman named Dinah, who I knew would immediately report to Harrington. "I heard sounds like someone moving around. You should tell the master." Dinah's eyes went wide. "Someone's in the library during dinner." "I think so. You'd better tell Master Harrington right away." She hurried to the dining room, and I positioned myself where I could watch what happened next. Through the doorway I saw Dinah whisper to Harrington. His face went from annoyed to alert to furious in the space of seconds. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. "Everyone stay here," he commanded his family and guests. He gestured to Barrett and another overseer who had been standing guard in the hallway. "Come with me. Someone's broken into my house." They moved toward the library, and I followed at a distance, playing the role of concerned slave. Harrington threw open the library door and stepped inside, holding a lamp high. For a moment there was nothing. Then Samuel, following my instructions, deliberately knocked over a book, creating a sound that drew Harrington's attention to the bookshelf. Harrington strode over and looked behind it, and his lamp illuminated two terrified young faces. "You?" he shouted. "Samuel, Rebecca, how did you bear it? There are more of them. Search the house." What followed was controlled chaos. Over the next 30 minutes, all 20 of the missing slaves were discovered in various locations throughout the mansion. Each discovery brought fresh outrage from Harrington, fresh confusion about how they could have infiltrated his house, fresh determination to punish them for their audacity. The slaves were dragged out to the yard and forced to their knees in the cold December night. Harrington stood before them, his face purple with rage, demanding to know where they had been for the past 2 weeks, how they had gotten into his house, who had helped them. But the 20 remained silent, their faces carefully blank, offering no explanations. They had been coached on what to say. Nothing. Let Harrington draw his own conclusions, create his own narrative. The less they said, the less chance of accidentally revealing the truth. Harrington ranted and threatened, but he was also relieved. He had found his missing slaves. They were not sold, not escaped to the north, not dead in the woods. They were here recaptured under his control once again. His reputation could be salvaged. He could tell people that the slaves had been hiding in the woods, planning this Christmas Eve infiltration, and that he had caught them in the act. It was not the complete victory he wanted, but it was better than the alternative. 20 slaves permanently lost, his reputation permanently damaged, his financial situation permanently compromised. He ordered them locked in the plantation jail, a small building used to confine slaves awaiting punishment. "We'll deal with them after Christmas," he said. "I'll decide then what their punishment will be." But I could see in his eyes that he would not sell them. He couldn't afford to now. The trader had already left, and finding another buyer would take time and effort. More importantly, selling them would be admitting defeat, admitting that they had won by forcing him to keep them. So they would be punished, certainly probably whipped, definitely subjected to increased surveillance and restrictions, but they would stay on the plantation. They would stay with their families, They would not be sold to the sugar plantations of Louisiana. The plan had worked. As the household settled down after the excitement, as the Christmas Eve dinner resumed, and the guests gossiped about the dramatic discovery, I slipped away to the quarters. The other slaves were buzzing with questions. Where had the 20 been hiding? How had they gotten into the mansion? Who had helped them? I said nothing, just smiled mysteriously and let them speculate. The legend was already forming. The 20 slaves who had vanished and then reappeared like ghosts, who had infiltrated the master's house on Christmas Eve, who had proven that even Harrington's grand mansion could not keep them out. But I knew the truth. The mansion had not kept them out. It had kept them in, hidden in its walls, protected by secrets that Harrington would never discover. The house he had built as a monument to his power had become a weapon against him, and he would never know. Over the next days, as Harrington dealt with the aftermath of the Christmas Eve incident, I observed him carefully. He was changed by the experience, more paranoid, more suspicious, more prone to seeing conspiracies where none existed. He had the mansion searched again, looking for evidence of how the 20 had gotten inside. But of course he found nothing. The hidden passages remained secret. The acoustic channels continued to carry sound from his private rooms to the cellar where I could listen. The chambers within the walls remained ready to hide people again if needed. Harrington thought he had won by recapturing his slaves, but he had actually lost something far more valuable: his sense of security, his confidence that he was in control, his belief that his house was truly his own. The mansion had become haunted not by supernatural spirits, but by the very real presence of slaves who had learned to move through its walls like ghosts, who had learned to use its secrets as weapons, who had proven that the master's power was not absolute. And I had become the keeper of those secrets, the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand that could reach into Harrington's life and manipulate it in ways he would never understand. The 20 slaves were whipped as I had known they would be, but they were not sold. They remained on the plantation with their families, alive and together, and they knew. We all knew that we had won a victory, small but significant, against the system that tried to crush us. The climax had passed. But the story was not over. The mansion still stood, still held its secrets, still waited to be used again, and I was ready. Ready to listen, ready to act, ready to use the weapon that Yibo and I had built to protect my people and strike back at our oppressor. The walls had ears, and they were listening. The years that followed the Christmas Eve incident transformed both the plantation and me in ways I could never have anticipated. The mansion that Harrington had built as a monument to his greatness became instead a source of constant unease, a place where he never felt truly secure, where shadows seemed to move on their own, and whispers echoed through empty hallways. I became the mansion's keeper in more ways than one. Officially, I was the house carpenter, responsible for maintenance and repairs. Unofficially, I was the master of its secrets, the one who knew every hidden passage, every acoustic channel, every concealed chamber, and I used that knowledge ruthlessly to protect my people and undermine Harrington's authority. The hidden chambers became a refuge for slaves who needed to disappear temporarily, those who were about to be sold, those who had committed some minor infraction and feared punishment, those who simply needed a few hours of peace away from the constant surveillance and brutality of plantation life. I would hide them in the walls, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for days, and then help them reappear in ways that confused and frustrated the overseers. Harrington's paranoia grew with each incident. He became convinced that there was a conspiracy against him, that his slaves had developed some supernatural ability to vanish and reappear at will. He brought in ministers to bless the house, hired investigators to find hidden passages. They never did. They didn't know where to look, and even consulted with a woman who claimed to be a spiritualist and who told him his house was built on cursed ground. None of it helped because the source of his torment was not supernatural, but human. Me and the network of trusted slaves I had recruited to help me use the mansion's secrets. I also used the acoustic channels to gather intelligence that I passed along to the Underground Railroad. By listening to Harrington's conversations, I learned about slave patrols, about which roads were being watched, about which local officials could be bribed. I passed this information to conductors who came through the area, helping them move fugitives more safely through South Carolina. In 1859, I helped 3 families escape to the north, using the mansion as a way station. I hid them in the attic chamber for 2 nights, while slave catchers searched the plantation, then guided them to the next safe house when the coast was clear. All 12 people made it to freedom, and Harrington never knew they had been living in his walls. But the greatest impact of what Yaboa and I had built was psychological. The slaves on Harrington's plantation knew that they had power that they could resist, that the master's control was not absolute. That knowledge changed them, made them bolder, more willing to engage in small acts of defiance. Productivity dropped as people worked more slowly, accidentally broke tools, misunderstood instructions. Harrington responded with increased brutality, but that only hardened people's resolve. The plantation became a place of constant low-level resistance, with the mansion at its center, a symbol of both Harrington's pride and his vulnerability. As for me, I changed as well. The frightened 16-year-old who had first learned of Yaboa's plan was gone, replaced by a man who understood that resistance took many forms, that intelligence and cunning could be as powerful as physical strength, that the most effective weapons were often invisible. I also fell in love. Her name was Dinina, the house slave who had unknowingly helped me during the Christmas Eve incident. She was smart and brave, and over time I brought her into the conspiracy, teaching her about the hidden passages, showing her how to use them. We married in a slave ceremony that had no legal standing, but meant everything to us, and we dreamed of the day when we might be free. That day came sooner than we expected, though not in the way we had hoped. In 1861, the Civil War began. South Carolina was one of the first states to secede from the Union, and the plantation was caught up in the fervor of Confederate nationalism. Harrington's sons joined the Confederate Army, and the plantation's production shifted to support the war effort. But the war also brought opportunity. As Union forces advanced into the South, slaves began to escape in large numbers, fleeing to Union lines where they would be considered contraband of war and given their freedom. The Underground Railroad's work became easier in some ways, more dangerous in others. I continued to use the mansion's secrets to help people escape, but I also began to plan for something bigger, a mass escape that would free everyone on the plantation at once. It was risky, perhaps impossible, but the chaos of war created opportunities that had not existed before. The opportunity came in 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Union forces were operating in South Carolina, and there were rumors that they would soon advance on our area. I began to coordinate with Union scouts, passing information about Confederate troop movements that I overheard through the acoustic channels, helping to plan the Union advance, and I prepared the slaves on the plantation for the moment when freedom would come. I used the hidden chambers to hold secret meetings, teaching people about the Emancipation Proclamation, explaining that they were legally free in Union-controlled territory, preparing them to leave when the time came. That time came in February of 1864, when Union forces advanced on the plantation. Harrington fled with his family, taking what valuables he could carry and abandoning the mansion and the land. The overseers scattered, unwilling to face Union soldiers, and 43 slaves walked away from the plantation as free people, many of them guided by me through routes I had scouted over years of helping fugitives escape. We didn't all go to the same place. Some joined the Union Army, eager to fight against the Confederacy. Others made their way to refugee camps established by the Union. Dinah and I, along with about 20 others, made our way to Charleston, which was under Union control, and began building new lives as free people, but I never forgot the mansion. Even after the war ended and Harrington's plantation was broken up and sold, I thought about the secrets hidden in those walls, the passages and chambers that had been our weapon against oppression. In 1867, I returned to the plantation. The mansion was still standing, though it was abandoned and beginning to fall into disrepair. The new owners, a northern company that had purchased the land, had no interest in the house, considering it too expensive to maintain. I walked through the empty rooms, remembering everything that had happened there. I opened the hidden panels and walked through the secret passages one last time, thinking about Yaboa and his genius, about the 20 people we had hidden in the walls, about all the ways we had used this house as a weapon. And I made a decision. I found the new owners and offered to purchase the mansion. They were happy to sell it to me for a fraction of its original value. A former slave buying his former master's house was an irony they found amusing. I used money I had saved from working as a carpenter in Charleston, and I became the owner of the house I had helped build, the house that contained secrets only I knew. I turned it into a school for freed slaves, teaching children and adults to read and write, providing a space where black people could gather and learn and build new lives. The hidden passages and chambers I kept secret, but I used them occasionally to hide people from the Ku Klux Klan when they came looking for uppity blacks to terrorize, to store weapons for self-defense, to hold secret meetings when we needed to organize against the violence and oppression of Reconstruction era. The mansion that Harrington had built as a monument to slavery became a monument to freedom. Jay Place, where former slaves learned to read, where communities organized, where resistance continued in new forms. Dinah and I raised 3 children in that house, teaching them about Yaboa's genius, about the secrets in the walls, about the importance of using intelligence and cunning to fight oppression. Our children grew up free, educated, proud of their heritage and their parents' resistance. I lived until 1903, long enough to see my grandchildren born, long enough to see the promise of Reconstruction betrayed and Jim Crow laws instituted, long enough to know that the fight for true freedom was far from over. But I also lived long enough to know that what Yaboa and I had built mattered. The mansion stood as proof that slaves were not powerless, that we could resist in ways our masters never imagined, that intelligence and planning could be as powerful as any weapon. On my deathbed, surrounded by my children and grandchildren, I told them the full story of the mansion's secrets. I showed them the hidden passages, the acoustic channels, the concealed chambers. I made them promise to preserve the house, to keep it as a monument to resistance, to never forget what it represented. Your great-grandfather Yaboa and I built this house twice, I told them. Once for Master Harrington, as a monument to his pride, and once for ourselves, as a weapon against oppression. The second house is the one that matters, the one that will endure. Remember that walls can have ears, that spaces can hold secrets, that the powerless are never truly powerless if they are willing to think, to plan, to resist. I closed my eyes for the last time, knowing that the mansion would stand, that its secrets would be preserved, that future generations would learn from what we had done. The walls had ears, and they would continue to listen, to remember, to bear witness to the truth that resistance takes many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones that remain hidden, known only to those who fought for them. This was the story of Kyle, born into slavery on the Harrington plantation in South Carolina around 1835, under the mentorship of the African-born architect Yaboa. He helped build the Harrington mansion with hidden passages and secret chambers that became weapons of resistance. After the Civil War, Kyle purchased the mansion and transformed it into a school for freed slaves. He lived until 1903, and the mansion remained in his family for 3 generations, serving